Hartelijk welkom bij een speciale editie van Alternatief TV en de andere krant. We zijn in de Russische Ambassade voor een exclusief interview met de heer Sjoelgin, de Russische Ambassadeur in Nederland. Geen misverstand. Ik ben een scherp tegenstander van de Russische invasie in Oekraïne. Zoals ik mijn leven lang ook de westerse militaire interventies heb bekritiseerd. Maar ik acht het ook cruciaal de dialoog met Rusland te voeren en te luisteren naar de argumenten van de andere kant. Het gaat over de toekomst van Europa, voor onszelf en onze kinderen. Willen we opnieuw een harde, wantrouwende, koude oorlog of willen we bouwen aan een Europa van dialoog en vertrouwen? Dit is Alternatief TV. Wij vragen door waar de media stopt. Ik ben Gietelink en mijn gast vandaag is de Russische ambassadeur Aleksander Sjoelgin. Mr. Sjoelgin, first of all, thank you very much by receiving us here. In the upcoming interview, I like to make clear what is the Russian position in the conflict with Ukraine. And my first question is, how are you, and what is the position of the embassy in this conflict?
Well, we are living through difficult times, and myself, some staff members of the embassy have been receiving threats lately. Someone threw a makeshift bomb at our consular section. We received also letters.
You received a bomb?
Yes, somebody threw the makeshift bomb at the consular section of the Russian embassy. And fortunately, it did not go off, and police came, and the threat was neutralized.
Right.
Afterwards, we received letters with some kind of white powder, in order to threaten us, to scare us. Russians living in the kingdom have been threatened also. Some people were denied service by companies. Some other lost their jobs. And this anti-Russian hatred increased to such a degree that at some point in time, Prime Minister Mr. Rutte had to call on the Dutch public opinion to refrain from verbal abuse and something worse towards Russian.
Right.
This is quite very sad situation.
Right. I heard as well this week that 17 diplomats were sent out.
Yes.
What is your reaction on that?
Well, indeed, on March the 29th, I was summoned to the Foreign Ministry of the Kingdom, and I was notified of the decision by the Dutch authorities to expel 17 member staff,
Right.
Both from the embassy and also trade mission.
Right.
Well, I asked, you do understand, my first reaction was to ask what are the grounds, what are the reasons for such decision by the Dutch authorities, and I had not been given any evidence. Specifically, I've been told that on the Dutch side there is hard evidence against these Russian diplomats, but Dutch counterpart said also, we would not show you this hard evidence. You should trust us just verbally. I expressed regret over this decision. I qualified it as unmotivated and unprovoked. And I also warned my Dutch counterpart that this unfriendly decision certainly, most certainly, would not be left unanswered, and there will be some kind of Russian reaction.
Right.
Whether this will be exactly the same measures, mirror measures, or some other measures, I can't say, but the Dutch side will learn about this in due time, and maybe it will be in very near future.
Yeah, the Dutch government called them intelligence officers, and the Dutch media is calling about spies. Mm-hmm. What are these people from your side?
These are member staff of the embassy, diplomats, and they have been working here in order to promote the bilateral agenda of our bilateral cooperation.
Right.
And it's very regrettable, unfortunate that so many diplomats have been asked to leave the kingdom. This will somehow negatively impact our capacities to go ahead with our cooperation.
Right. When you look to the Dutch media, right, the Western media in general, but the Dutch media in specific, what do you think?
The impression is that the Dutch media, in their coverage of events, current events, they are just very one-sided, lopsided in their depiction of the situation in Ukraine.
Right.
They use mostly Ukrainian sources whose impartiality is not at all guaranteed. This is clear. This appears apparent even to some Dutch journalists, who have started to question the information, the quality of the information coming from Kiev sources.
Right.
And for our part, we advise the Dutch media to check their material thoroughly.
Right.
So as not to be misled by the Ukrainian fake news.
Yeah. You would say that the Dutch media is colored, it's one-sided on the side of the Ukraine, and there is a lot of fake news which is coming out of Kiev sources.
Yes,
right.
And quite unilateral coverage of the events without taking into account any of the Russian point of view.
Right. I want to go back with you to the causes of this war, which is it's a tragedy going on, right? And I like you to take back to 1989. We were both there. We still remember that, the time of Gorbachev. What went wrong afterwards? What went wrong from the Russian position?
Well, this is a very good question, and it will take some time to respond to your question. Maybe we should go think back to this period of time in order to trace the sources of current tensions.
Right.
Following the fall of the Berlin Wall,
right,
and the ensuing detente, perestroika, Gorbachev, people felt euphoric. Many people felt relieved, uninhibited. Some even went so far as to speak about the end of time. The end of time meaning...
The end of history, they call it.
The end of history, you know.
Right.
Back then, for many people, future looked cloudless, bright, shiny.
Right.
Unfortunately, this sentiment proved to be short-lived.
Mm-hmm.
The reason was that the United States and their allies considered themselves as winners of the Cold War.
Right.
Consequently, the Americans and the others tended to treat Russia as a loser. At best, they were just condescending towards us. Bill Clinton allowed himself to tap Boris Yeltsin on the shoulder. Such paternalistic attitude on the American side was induced by the perception of Russians being ready to accept Western supremacy. And for good reason. At some point in time, there was a Russian foreign minister, and, he took pleasure in assuring the Americans that Russia actually, back then, in the 1990s, Russia did not have any national interests at all. Instead, according to then Russian foreign minister, Russia diluted itself in the microcosm of universal values.
Mm-hmm.
Agreeably surprised by such narrative coming from the Russian side, America was absolutely enthusiastic. The Americans were absolutely enthusiastic.
Right.
And this exchange can be found in some memoirs. I guess that it was reported by then State Secretary of the United States, Mr. Christopher.
Right.
You may look into this memoir, and it was documented. The Russian minister saying, no, Russia has no national interest whatsoever. Russia will stick only to the universal values. Okay, said the Americans. If this is your position, you Russians, you will simply watch us, the Americans, and you will follow us, whatever we may do, whatever we may think. We, the Americans, will be the leaders, and you, Russians, since you don't have any of your national interests anymore, you will try to stick to us and comply with all of our decisions.
Right.
As Putin came to power,
Right.
this situation of the Russian Federation being subjugated by Washington started to change slowly but steadily.
Right. From 2000, Mr.
Yes.
Putin came in 2000 to power, and then years after it was changed.
And the rise of Russians awoken from, how should I say, lethargic drowsiness became apparent for Western countries as early in 2007. I'm referring to the 27th Munich Security Conference.
Right.
2007.
Right.
Back then, Putin made a remarkable speech interpreted by the Western countries and especially by the Americans as the proof of Russia getting off its knees. Very jealous of their status of a single superpower, the Americans tried by all means to contain Russia. Even before 2014, the year of Crimea reuniting with Russia,
Right.
the Americans chose to rebuff our country.
Right.
Just remember the so-called Magnitsky Act,
Right.
aimed at damaging, above all, Russian economy.
Right.
And then came, you remember this Pussy Riot story, which resulted in all-out campaign to blame Russia for allegedly homophobic legislation.
Yeah, I remember,
Since then, things were getting worse and worse. And finally, we arrived at the point where we are now.
What is the place from NATO from 1999 to 2020? NATO went eastwards, right? A lot of countries from the east of Europe, 14 countries came to NATO. And we have very much the feeling that this expansion of NATO, which is coming now on the point of Ukraine, is one of the big sources of the problem and the war, or the operation, as you call it, which is going on now. Is that right? What is the place of NATO expansion?
Honestly, there were some illusions on the Russian side as to the role of NATO as a possible pillar of the European security. Quite recently, I guess, maybe 3 weeks ago, Vladimir Putin himself confessed about his probing, his interrogating Bill Clinton, then American president, as to hypothetical Russian membership in NATO.
Right.
And Clinton, according to Putin, he just sneered, mocked him in response. No, he said, Bill Clinton said, it simply can't happen. Over a number of years.
Right. This is important because Putin said this in his speech in the 21st of February, right? Last February.
Yes.
And he told the audience that he had in 2000 this conversation with Bill Clinton, the outgoing president of the US, that he offered the possibility that Russia would be part of NATO.
And it was rejected. It was rejected without any kind of explanation. But to continue our reasoning, over
you got a feeling that we here in the West made you to the enemy. That there is a plan that we in the West, the Americans and the Europeans, made the big bear Russia to the enemy. And this is the main problem of what is happening now.
Well, I would say just in a little bit different way about what happened. Over a number of years, we have been very accommodative with regard to NATO. We were, for instance, very reluctant to the Baltic states entering NATO.
Right.
However, we listened to the Americans. They have been swearing, they swore, saying, once admitted to NATO, Baltic countries will be absolutely reassured under the Atlantic umbrella. Therefore, they will be, as by magic, best friends of Russia, Baltic states. We let ourselves be convinced by such reasoning. Needless to say that this turned out to be quite the other way around. Emboldened by NATO membership, NATO protection, Baltic countries, already unfriendly to Russia, proved to be our worst enemies. And then came, it's very important to bear this in mind, then came what is known as the American Anti-Ballistic Defense System Initiative.
Right.
You remember back in 21, I guess, 24, they withdrew from the ABM treaty.
Right.
And it was starting point for arms race. We objected against the Americans leaving the ABM treaty.
Mm-hmm.
We said, make no mistake, this will be a very dangerous move, since the risk of war would be much higher. Indeed, it would be very tempting for the Americans, once they are shielded by the ABM defense system,
Right.
to carry out a nuclear strike, first nuclear strike, if you are completely protected and assured against possible retaliatory strike. Nevertheless, the Americans just brushed aside our objections. Back then, they kept saying the ABM defense system put forward by the Americans is not against Russia. It's against some rogue states, and first of all, Iran.
Right.
Well, however, after the first nuclear deal with Iran was reached, the US still maintained their plan to go ahead with the ABM defense system, notwithstanding complete elimination of the Iranian nuclear threat. Back then, I'm referring to the first nuclear deal with Iran. And thus it became clear the ABM defense system, global shield, like the Americans used to call it, was a 100% anti-Russian project whose aim was to strip Russia of the possible strike in response to the first American nuclear attack.
Yeah, so what you say, it was not against Iran, it was against Russia.
Against Russia, absolutely. We have absolutely no doubt about this. And we tried to negotiate with the Americans to find some kind of reasonable solution.
Right.
Just to remember you, since the Americans seemed to be preoccupied with the threat coming from Iran, at some point in time, we suggested, let's do this shield ABM defense system jointly. Let it be a global system. And we were ready, even ready to share with the Americans the possibility of using special radar station in Gabala. You remember this case? And they just rejected this because they were absolutely not interested in this. Their goal was just to make Russia vulnerable and exposed to the possible first nuclear strike by the American forces. Back in December last year, we made far-reaching proposals to enhance European security. To refresh your memory, I will just dwell on three basic elements contained in our proposals. First, no further eastward NATO expansion.
Right.
Second, returning to the configuration of forces as it was in 1997 when the founding act Russia-NATO was signed. And third element, very important element, non-deployment of weapon systems within striking distance from the vital centers of the Russian Federation.
Right.
Let me explain you. With the prospect of Ukrainian entering NATO, there may be missile systems, weapon systems being deployed just on the frontier boundaries with the Russian Federation. Right. If this is the case, the flying time for these weapons to hit targets, maybe in Moscow or in St. Petersburg, will be just 5 or 7 minutes.
Right.
It's very short period of time.
The Americans and Ukrainians had already planned exercises, military exercises on the Russian borders, right?
So for us, it was quite inadmissible threat. We should have thought about rejecting, about protecting, shielding ourselves from this threat.
Right.
And these were quite simple, quite transparent and reasonable proposals. But the Americans and NATO countries turned our proposals down under the pretext of the NATO open doors policy.
Right.
Saying we just are ready to admit every country willing to join the alliance.
Except Russia.
Yes.
Except Russia.
Except Russia. Except
Right. That's a bit the problem, of course.
Well, at this turn of the negotiations, we reminded them, the Americans, about the principle of the indivisible security as it is enshrined in international documents and specifically in the 1999 Charter for New Europe's Istanbul Charter, but also in the OSCE Astana Declaration, the principle of indivisible security, which creates obligation for every state in the Euro-Atlantic region not to build its security at the expense of other states.
Right. So what you say is the NATO is breaking this contract.
And you remember back then, Russian Minister Sergei Lavrov sent messages, letters to NATO countries, to the United States, asking them to explain how they interpret this obligation, this commitment to the principle of indivisible security. And there was a common response by the European Union. We expected them to respond in national capacities because these commitments were approved on the national level, but there was just a joint response. And Russian proposal, yet again, has been rejected, and their argument actually boiled down to the assurance that NATO did not have any aggressive plans and against Russia, and more to the point, NATO is a quite peaceful organization, defensive organization, which is only looking for the defensive interests.
Right.
Back then, we reminded that NATO is a all but not defensive alliance. We pointed out to NATO aggression in Yugoslavia,
right,
back in 1999. 6 weeks of endless bombardments, bridges
in Serbia.
In Serbia.
Right.
Then remember what happened in Libya in violation of the United Nations Security Council resolution. Then came Iraq, then Afghanistan. So NATO is all...
and this is all NATO as well? Iraq and Afghanistan is...
Yes, because predominantly these were all NATO countries.
Right, that's true.
And, again, the US and their allies, they were quite negligent, and they just laughed at our preoccupation. And apparently, this was the very last drop that overflowed the cup. Like they are saying, there is British saying, this was the straw that broke the camel's back. Enough is enough, and that...
Well, what was the point? What was the point? Because you said this was the straw, this was the line. What was the line? Where they crossed the line?
Total rejection of Russian proposals, legitimate proposals to strengthen European security. Our proposals were logic and quite simple. Let's do our best to ease tensions. Let's not to enhance, to strengthen your security at the expense of the Russian security.
And these proposals were from last December?
Last December. We made public 2 draft documents, agreement with the United States on mutual guarantees, and also agreement with with NATO countries.
Right, right.
Just to think about the Americans, should they be faced with the prospect of Russian arms, Russian missiles, installed positions stationed near their vital centers with only 5 or 6 minutes of flying time to hit targets?
Right.
What would have been
in Mexico and Cuba, you mean?
For instance.
Right.
For instance. So I'm inclined to tell you that this was a breaking point, and we completely lost any illusions about capacity of the Americans and their allies to negotiate and to observe, respect their obligations under international treaties.
So you lost it when I'm making it clear, December 2021, last December.
Yes.
I mean, this was the breaking point.
Breaking point.
Let's go to Maidan, because Maidan 2014, right? What happened on Maidan? I think it's one of the big causes for you. What in your view happened in Maidan, and what was the result for that in the Russian position?
Well, just in a few words, obsessed with their policy of color revolutions, regime change, the United States, the Americans, heavily invested themselves in stoking tensions in Ukraine around the Maidan protest, Maidan manifestation. Then President of the United States, Barack Obama, had several calls over the phone with Vladimir Putin, asking him to talk then Ukrainian President Yanukovych into not using any force against people on Maidan Place. And then at some point in time, France, Germany, and Poland offered to be guarantors of the deal concluded between Ukrainian opposition and Yanukovych.
Right.
Only to just shrug and say, c'est la vie, 24 hours later, as the Maidan leaders proclaimed themselves the only power in Ukraine, making Yanukovych flee the country.
To Russia.
Yes, and soon afterwards, Western countries de facto blessed the Maidan winner, Poroshenko, to unleash military force against people of Donbas who were not ready to accept the coup perpetrated in Kiev with all the consequences for the Russian-speaking people in eastern Ukraine, the ban on the Russian language, the glorification of fascist auxiliaries, Bandera.
Right. Well, let me ask some things about the Donbas republics. You, in 2014, you recognized Crimea, right? There were referenda in Crimea, in Donetsk, and in Luhansk. You recognized Crimea as part of Russia. You didn't recognize Donetsk and Luhansk, in which you accepted in a certain way that it is Ukrainian territory, and that the Ukrainian reacted with a civil war.
Actually,
you think that when you look back, that there is a mistake in this?
No, it was not a mistake, because our idea was to help by all means peaceful settlement of these very painful situation. And you remember in 2015, under the auspices of Russia, France, and Germany, it became possible to conclude the so-called Minsk agreements. The Minsk agreements were about roadmap to achieve the settlement with at least 10 specific measures, consequences of steps to be taken. a very clear picture what was needed to do in order to go ahead. It was about amnesty for the people involved in military operations. It was about autonomous status of Donbas region. It was about the necessity for the Ukrainians to insert necessary amendments to the constitution, ceasefire, retreat, removal from heavy weapons.
So on this point you can say you accepted
yes.
that the Donbas regions
yes.
were part of the Ukraine.
As long as Ukrainian authorities, key authorities, were ready to go ahead with the implementation of the Minsk agreements. But sadly enough, they sabotaged the Minsk agreements, and at no point in time they had been willing to go ahead with the implementation. They kept looking for all kinds of pretexts to avoid this from happening. Poroshenko at some point in time was accused by the far right activists of state treason, and 8 years on, at some point in time, Zelensky said, no, we will not be in compliance with the Minsk agreements because it does not fit our interests. So,
wow.
And they gave up. They did not want to go ahead with the Minsk agreements, and instead, for all this period of time, 8 years, they have been shelling Donbas region, killing civilians, people, killing children, and it was also...
How many people were killed, I mean, in your views?
Well, I guess there is... this is public figure. 14,000 people died in the Donbas region from 2014 to 2022. And more to the point, children were killed. And in Donetsk, the capital of Donbas,
right.
there is a memorial which is called Alley of Angels, dedicated to children, I guess 200 children,
right.
Of various ages died from...
by bombardments,
yes.
Ukrainian bombardments on Donetsk and
Let
Luhansk.
me just make this observation. Western media, they did not, they completely obfuscated the fact that the main casualties during these 8 years of conflict was on the side of Donbas, Luhansk and Donetsk. Lots of devastations, people injured, killed, and practically no destruction on the other side, on the side detained by Ukrainian forces. And this was completely obfuscated. The Western media did not show this whole picture.
Right.
While showing the some side of story, they completely put aside the other side of the story.
I heard there were a lot of refugees as well from the Donbas to Russia.
Yes.
How many refugees were there from the Donbas region to Russia the last eight years? They mostly go, I heard, to the south of Russia.
Yes. There were some figures published. I can't give you a global picture, global figure, but I was told that at least thousands people from Donbass fled the region to escape the war, and they found refuge on the Russian territory.
Right. Well, one of the questions on the 21st of February, Mr. Putin recognized the sovereignty of Donetsk and Luhansk, right? Finally, you can say.
Yes.
One of the questions a lot of people ask, okay, we understand that he did this, right? And maybe we can understand as well the fact that the Russians say we want to defend our Russian neighbors, right? Against Ukrainian aggression. But why didn't you limit the military action to Donbass? That's one of the questions a lot of people have. Why didn't you limit the military action to Donbass then?
The explanation has been provided as late as a few days ago by General Rudskoy during his briefing. He explained Russian military plans, moving forces from three directions, north, south, and east, turned out to be part of the plan by the Russian military, which aim was to immobilize the bulk of Ukrainian forces around some big cities so as to facilitate the encirclement by Russian forces of the big Ukrainian army in Donbas region. The encirclement will be, in the mind of the Russian generals, will be necessary prerequisite condition for the defeat and capitulation of this Ukrainian contingent. You know, this is kind of encirclement in eastern Ukraine. If I'm not mistaken, at least 50,000 of elite Ukrainian forces.
50 or 15?
50,000. 50,000 are now stationed on the territory of Donetsk Republic. This republic has been liberated for only 60%, and 40% left still under the control of this Ukrainian contingent. And as General Rudskoy stated, we will now refocus our military effort to this region, Donbas region. We will drastically reduce military activities around Kiev, Chernihiv, and we will do our best to complete the encirclement of the Ukrainian nationalist battalions in Donbas in order to defeat them and to put an end to endless shelling and bombing of Donetsk region.
One of the main cities in Donetsk is Mariupol. Mariupol is part of Donetsk, right? There's this Azov battalion. It seems to be that the battle now is about Mariupol. Is it right that you still think and find that Mariupol has to be part of Donetsk, and that you see it as let's say, Donetsk region, and it has to be Russian region? as well in the final agreement.
Well,
the question with it is, what do the people of Mariupol themselves think about that?
Well, at this point in time, we should not anticipate further developments.
Right.
Like we said, our main goals are we are not willing to occupy Ukraine. This is a very important thing. We should bear this in mind. No intention whatsoever to occupy the Ukrainian territory.
Right.
Our main goals is to denazify Ukraine, to demilitarize Ukraine.
Right.
And these objectives are within our reach as regards the demilitarization.
Right.
We may state that as of today, we have destroyed practically 75% of the Ukrainian military arsenal.
Right.
Lots of planes shot down, tanks destructed, demolished. So the demilitarization is going ahead. Denazification, very important thing also. And as we speak of the denazification, we can't help but think about the infamous Azov battalion.
Right.
Even the United States Congress at some point in time listed this Azov battalion as a terrorist entity committed to Nazi ideology. But nowadays, the Americans and their allies appear to forget about the Nazi background of the Azov unity. Importantly, they simply dismiss warnings about the rise of Nazi in Ukraine. And even here in The Hague, I sometimes hear people shrugging off the argument about the danger of Nazism in Ukraine. For instance, I had some talks here with the people in The Hague, and sometimes, most often, they said, "Mr. Ambassador, it's nonsensical what you are saying about Ukrainian Nazis. This is simply inconceivable, given that the current Ukrainian president is Jew himself." But, this is a very fallacious reasoning, to put it mildly.
Right.
Nowadays, we observe the glorification of Nazi collaborators in Ukraine to the effect that state owners, just think about this, about the state owners are rendered to the veterans of the SS Division Galicia. Those are people who are guilty of atrocious crimes, especially against Jews. Indeed, a commander of Ukrainian Guard of Honor was seen exchanging greetings with one of these SS veterans. The SS veteran was calling out, "Glory to Ukraine." And then comes the rejoinder, the response by the commander of the Guard of Honor of President Zelensky, "Glory to heroes." Unthinkable. It looks like a sacrilege. Just think about the military commander of the Presidential Guard calling the SS auxiliary a hero.
Right, right.
And the Jewish president, Zelensky, does he take any position? Is he confused? No, he is not. This Jewish president just looks the other way. Is not this hard evidence of the so-called Jewish presidents condoning the Nazi values? Mm-hmm. As for the people of Mariupol, according to some statistics, there were about 400 before this special operation, 400,000. Many of them have been evacuated through humanitarian corridors, and even this morning there was operation to evacuate people. Coaches, buses were already ready, but the Nazi battalion, so this Azov battalion, did not stop the shellings, and the operation was hampered by these Ukrainian battalions. So people are very unhappy with this position, because apparently, and this can be seen not only in Mariupol but in other places also. They are using civilian population as human shield. They are protecting themselves with this civilian population. It's
battalion.
very unfortunate.
Yeah, because what is a very important question when we talk about the future of Donbass, right? Is what do the people think by themselves? Are the Russians prepared to ask this to the people? Are the Russians prepared to say, even when they control Donbass, a referendum has to decide what is the future for Mariupol and Donetsk and Luhansk?
Well, it will be up to the people of Donetsk and Luhansk Republic to find the best way to organize themselves. And let's not anticipate. We will see how things will play out. For the time being, we just recognized their sovereignty, but things can be seen in different ways. Let me remind you that maybe a week ago, the head of Lugansk Republic, Mr. Pasechnik, hinted at the possibility of Luhansk Republic to ask the Russian Federation to consider the possibility of Luhansk joining the Russian Federation. This was just a hint without any further comments, elaborations, but again, Russia is not holding any kind of referendums over there. It will be up to the people of Donbass to decide themselves and to determine their...
But for you, I mean, can you say that the independence of Donetsk and Luhansk is an intermediate step to be part of the Russian Federation? I mean, will the future not be that Donetsk and Luhansk has to be part of the Russian Federation?
I am not saying this. Our goal, the goal of the special operation, is just to save people of Donbass region from this existential threat. You remember just 10 days ago, atrocious scene in the center city of Donbass, missile point U was used by the Ukrainian military. These missile shot down by the Russian defense landed in the center city, and at least 20 people, civilians, were killed, including children. But this fact was not covered at all by the Western media, or just to the contrary. One of the Italian magazines, I guess Stampa, published the photo of the massacre, and the legend was it is the consequences, these are the consequences of the use of the Russian weaponry by the Russian. By the Russian, the other way around.
But to go back for a moment to Mariupol, right? Mm-hmm. I think it's a fundamental question from the Ukrainian side as well, from the Western side, is the Azov battalion is defending Mariupol, mm-hmm. and the Russians want to occupy it. And you are saying the Russians want to liberate it, right? Yes. Is it, I mean, it's a fundamental thing if you say occupy or liberate, right? Mm-hmm. And the only ones who can decide that mm-hmm. are the people themselves. Mm-hmm. And I can imagine the people themselves, it's about 400,000 people there. Mm-hmm. Are the Russians prepared to give the people the possibility to choose if they wants to be part of the Donetsk region and independent, or be part of the Ukraine?
Like I said, it will be up to the people of Mariupol, as other regions of Ukraine, to decide of their fate. It will be their choice. And again, please bear in mind, make no mistakes, we are not willing to occupy Ukraine. This is not our goal. Our goal is just to demilitarize Ukraine, so that Ukraine would no more pose an existential threat to the Russian Federation, because you may have heard that the bigger project of the United States was to create a kind of anti-Russia on the Ukrainian territory, to pose this serious threat to the Russian Federation. So we would like to remove this threat, to get rid of the Nazi at various echelons, at various stages of the Ukrainian power. And afterwards, it will be up to the Ukrainian people, to the people of Donbass, Luhansk, Mariupol, to think about the best way to continue to live.
And this is possible to do it with referenda, because it's a very important question. When it comes onto Mariupol, when the Russians would have the power to take Mariupol, right? What will be the future? You would hand it over to Donetsk, or is there as well possible a future that the people of Mariupol can decide by themselves by referendum?
It's too early to think about future developments. We are not yet at this point. No. We're still at the point when Nazi battalions are using civilians and human shield. These are atrocious scenes of people able to escape from Mariupol, saying they have been shot back in the back, and this is very inhuman situation. Right. So it's too early to think about this. Let's first put an end to these atrocities.
Right. I'd like to come to an end of this interview with some questions about looking back. You and me are born in the height of the Cold War. We still remember the end of it. Are we going back to a new Cold War in Europe? And is this not the big tragedy of our time?
Yes, you're right. I'm also a child of the Cold War. As a boy, I had recollection of the tensions due to the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Right.
My friends spoke back then about the war, and then I still remember some documentary films picturing Kremlin, the voice of speaker saying, "This is the voice of reason coming from Moscow," and the crisis was resolved. The threat of the nuclear war has been removed.
Mm-hmm.
I may confess you that during most of my life, I never experienced this sentiment of very serious threat of nuclear war, of catastrophe. But then, maybe 3 years ago, there was a very, very dangerous episode. You remember there was a chemical provocation in Duma near Damascus. And the Americans, without any proofs, as usually, without any proofs, they were set to launch missile strike.
Right.
And
in Syria, you mean?
In Syria. And Russian military command, because Russian forces were also stationed and still are stationed in Syria.
Right.
They issued some warning saying, should the American missiles be flying towards Russian targets, Russian bases, Russia will be using force, will be retaliate, shooting down not only the American missiles, but also the carriers from which these weapons, these missiles are used. And my personal feeling was very uneasy. For the first time in 50 years, I said myself, oh my God, we are nearing the precipice, the brink of the catastrophe. But when
because it could be a confrontation between American military and Russian military.
For instance, the Americans launch missiles, and these missiles are hitting Russian targets in Syria, and Russia retaliating will, for instance, sink the American aircraft carrier in the Mediterranean Sea. This will be very dangerous. We will be just on the brink of the nuclear war. This was first alarm, and now, unfortunately, you see that the Americans are playing with fire, and they're doing their best to antagonize the Russian Federation. Their goal is to let war, let military operation in Ukraine go ahead, and they would like to see that this would be kind of attrition war, lengthy war, so as to weaken even more the Russian Federation already under the sanctions. And this is very sad, because in this case we can't help but see this very, very dangerous role played by Washington, and this is not a good sign for our future.
Well, when to the end, when we look now to the Ukraine, because the war is going on there, right? Don't you think that I mean the poor population of Ukraine, but as well the poor population of Russia and the poor population in a certain mind of Europe is paying the price. First of all, Ukraine poor population as well, the Russian population, maybe as well in future. Don't you think this price for the poor populations is too high on what we see now? I mean, we understand your goals and we understand as well the causes of it. But don't you think that the price the poor populations have to pay for what is happening now is too high?
Well, I guess so that you will be... you'd rather ask the question to the President Zelensky. You know, he was elected in 2019 over the promise to bring peace, to bring about peace settlements.
Right.
But he was not he did not meet the the hopes of the Ukrainian population, because he bears the entire responsibility for this kind of situation. Why so? Because first, he distanced himself from the Minsk agreements. This was the real path to the peaceful settlement with Donbas region still part of Ukraine, but he did not want to do so. He did not live up to his promises. Second, he let Nazi go ahead, because at some point in time it became quite intolerable, this rise of Nazi ideology. Just bear in mind, play manuals in school, history manuals are conceived in a manner that Ukrainian children will be educated in the spirit of hatred for the Russians.
Right.
Russia has been pointed out as a main enemy of Ukraine. How come? Russia was always with Ukraine. We fought together against fascist Germany, and right. This is the way to excite the anti-Russian sentiment. We remember maybe 6 weeks ago or 2 months ago, there was a football match here, played in Amsterdam, and the Ukrainian supporters were chanting, Muscovites should be hanged, Muscovites should be killed. And this was general sentiment, hatred, anti-Russian hatred, and it has blown up under the presidency of Mr. Zelensky. So he is the main culprit of this whole situation. As for the price,
you want to say that he thought he would bring peace. This is why he was elected, but in fact he is escalating the process.
Yes,
and making enemies, especially anti-Russian enemies.
This is exactly what happened. As for the price to pay, I'm pretty sure that Russian people are ready to sustain this whole situation. And we are ready to pay price for our country in order to get Russia safe, to remove existential threat against the Russian Federation, and also save people from Donbas region from very real threat of extermination. So to achieve this goal, Russian people are ready to pay price. And it's very important to say that President Putin is strongly supported by the Russian population. Let it be no illusions about so-called fifth column people trying to be detrimental, to harm the policy of the Russian president. This is not the case. Russians are strongly supporting their president.
Right. Okay.
Thank you.
May I thank you very much for this interview, Mr. Sjoelgin.